All right, good morning. We are very pleased to have everyone here at the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network Conference. We're coming close to the end of the month. I know they've been having sessions all month. This session today will be focused on structural racialization, and then tomorrow you guys, for those who have registered, can participate in the last session, which my colleague will be doing. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction. My name is Kimberly Merchant. I am the director of the Racial Justice Institute at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. Been running the institute for about 3 years. It is a 6-month training program for legal aid and social justice, public interest lawyers who are interested in either building their capacity around race justice advocacy or who just want to hone the skills that they already have. At the conclusion of the institute, they then move on to the network, which is the counterpart to the institute, where we continue the connection with those advocates, as well as continue ongoing sort of capacity building courses. I want to now take a pause so that my colleague can introduce himself, the man behind the scenes who's sort of helping make all of this happen today. Generic.
Hey, everybody. My name is Generic Holmes. I'm the Associate Director of the Racial Justice Institute. I've been with the Shriver Center for about 5 years now, and look forward to getting to know you all today. And as Kim mentioned, we have another session with you all tomorrow, which is implicit bias. Just kind of looking at the ways that it manifests in our lives at work, and kind of thinking about how that ripples out to society more broadly. And then, so I'm leading that session tomorrow. I got a message from Kelly. I guess one of the last things we just want to mention is that both sessions are eligible for CLE credit. And so
I was just about to get to that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll let you take it from there.
And then you can jump in. So Generic was saying both sessions will be subject to CLE credit. So there'll be 2 attendance polls throughout the presentation. About 45 minutes into the session, there'll be 1 attendance poll that Generic will put up. He'll leave it up for a few minutes to give you an opportunity to click yes, that you are actively participating, right? And then there'll be a second poll towards the end, another 40 or 45 minutes into the session, that you'll have to click, yes, I am participating. And if you do click both polls, 1 and 2, then that will make you eligible for CLE purposes. Is anything else in addition to that, Jay?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, let's roll. So today's session is really to introduce you to a concept called structural racialization. Structural racialization is a more complex way, really, of thinking about race. And I think, given where we are in our nation right now, we have to really be thinking about it a more complex way, getting away from the idea of some sort of bad actor who has some sort of malice or animus towards a particular group. That does exist. So intentional racism exists. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But given the way it manifests and produces itself and creates these inequitable outcomes that we see in the work that we do, I think as advocates, we really sort of need to know and understand the more complex concept of structural racialization. So we're going to jump in that today. And as such, we'll identify examples of different kinds of racialization. We'll talk about racialization on the various levels that exist. And then you will have an opportunity to sort of jump in and participate and see how it works. And ultimately, the idea is that you'll be able to sort of analyze public policies that create and perpetuate racial advantage for some and disadvantage for others. So we're going to start with this large group presentation, which is very interactive, and that's what I'm about to roll into right now. We'll then have some small group discussion where you will be able to take the 4 levels of racialization that we'll talk about and apply it. And Jay, if you could mute whoever's talking, I appreciate it. And then we'll come back to the large group to do a debrief, and then I'll be here to answer any questions that you have. Just really briefly, the Shriver Center, we lead the fight for economic and racial justice by litigating, shaping policy, and training and connecting people in the advocacy community. we don't just fight for communities affected by poverty, we work alongside them, advocating for solutions that are informed by their lived experiences. And part of the work that we do at Shriver, it's called the Advocate Resources and Training Department, which is where Generic and I work. And in that department, we're sort of the arm of Shriver that does the training, that does the capacity building and the connecting of advocates across the nation. And we do that in 4 areas: racial justice, which is sort of the sub part that you'll be involved in today. That's where structural racialization falls. We also get into community power. Some people hear it called community movement, or lawyer movement, or community lawyering. So there's lots of different names for that. We also do leadership development, understanding that each of you has a role to play to sort of step up and make this happen, as well as training supervisors around what it looks like to supervise across differences. And then affirmative advocacy, which is our affirmative litigation training course that we provide. And then to drill down a little deeper, under the Advocate Resources and Training Department is the Racial Justice Institute, which is what I'm the director of, and Generic is the associate director. I told you a little bit about it earlier. Our 2020 class has just graduated, and we'll be dropping our next application in January. So anyone who's interested, please feel free to leave your email address in the chat pod, and Jay can collect those for us, and we'll put you on the mailing list so that when we make the announcement, you'll be sure to get it. In the Institute, we teach 7 core practices. Structural racialization is the foundational practice that we teach, which is what we're going to be hitting on today. And tomorrow, Jay will dive a little deeper, which is what we layer structural racialization with, this idea of social cognition and implicit bias. And then we talk about systems thinking, how to think about this work on a more systemic level. Community lawyering, which we mentioned earlier, this multi-form advocacy. As lawyers, we tend to gravitate towards litigation. There's so many other tools in our toolbox to make this work sort of happen. Framing and communications, the importance of changing the narrative, the importance of creating the narrative around how we talk about race moving forward. And framing and communications is a way to do that without appearing divisive, or without hopefully getting people to shut down, so that folks will sort of listen to your message as you're advocating on a particular component. And then leadership and organizational alignment, both understanding the role we each play as leaders in this fight, but also the importance of internally our organizations being aligned for race equity in order to be successful in the external work. Are we sort of walking our talk? All right, so a little homework. I just want to take a pause right here to see who had an opportunity to sort of read either some of the articles. The second article here was really short. It's like 2 pages, very quick. The House We Live In is a great documentary that talks about redlining, and it's a great example of this idea of structural racialization and sort of the history behind how we got from intentional policies to discriminate, and how that even plays an effect in how housing and segregation is today in our country. And Jay, if you could mute. And then Professor Powell, who is sort of the godfather of structural racialization, there was a video there where he's sort of talking about conceptually what it is. And then Being Black in America's Hazards to Your Health is another article, which is a great example of structural racialization. So I want to really hear from you. I want to know who had an opportunity to either read or watch any of these, and whether there was anything that you found interesting or anything that resonated with you. So you could do 1 or 2 things. You can share with me in this chat pod. I'm going to try to pull the chat pod up so I can see. You can share with me in the chat pod, or you can unmute and share out with the group really briefly. Anyone who actually had an opportunity to read any of it, just want to know, want to hear from you before we get started.
Read all 3.
Not all 3, any of them. Anything that just resonated with you. You're going to share with us, Valerie?
John Powell is an old friend of mine, so I couldn't have missed that one if I wanted to. Read about him again. And I read the Affirmative Action for Whites, and that history is huge, and it has effects still today that we've not fixed, and that was disturbing for me.
Thank you, Valerie. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
We sneaked ahead on one article, I think, for tomorrow about working with the courts. And we have a federal court judge who's retired and now come back to Lancaster. he would be excellent. He would just absolutely be excellent at leading it because he's so well respected by our court. And he's just wonderfully articulate and just a terrific person.
Okay, anything in particular? I mean, you probably already know this stuff given your relationship with Professor Powell, but you already said that the long history of affirmative action for whites was really resonated with you. Yeah, history is very critical. And we'll talk about that a little bit during this presentation, the importance of understanding sort of the root cause, the core, the history that brings us to where we are today. Every equity that we see has a history, has a story, has a journey that brought us there. Anyone else? Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate you. Anyone else who wants to share out about what they read or saw in any of these documentaries? All right, well then that's my cue to move forward. Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate you sharing out and for, preparing for today's session, but these will still be there. So for those who haven't had an opportunity to read, if you're curious, they're not going away. So you still have time to sort of catch up on your homework.
Kim,
right,
you have
so
one comment in the chat pod from Natalie Bogerman.
Yeah, Natalie, thank you. She said, I've heard of redlining before, but had not read about it in depth. It was stunning to realize the details of what had happened, that it could happen, and how directly it impacts the day. Yes, it's hard to believe that there was a time where people made policies that were intentionally racist and no one sort of checked them on it, or it was like it was what was happening at that point. Soldiers were coming back from the war, soldiers of color who just wanted to have the same opportunities that their counterparts, white counterparts did, and they were directly denied that opportunity. And also we have to understand how what happened with redlining in the house we lived in has created sort of that whole wealth gap. So you had a whole subset of folks who were able to sort of start building their wealth through ownership of property and homes and houses, and of course disadvantaging communities of color, or the Black soldiers who came back who were not able to take advantage of that same thing. So yes, thank you so much, Natalie. Okay, some more comments jumping in. And you guys are moving fast now. Max, what struck me is some of the parallels to our younger generation. If home ownership was and is key to wealth accumulation, what does it mean that our children are even interested in it? Yeah, Max, I think that's great. And that's one component, one way of really understanding what the future does hold. Amy, from the article Structural Racialization, I found the spike fence concept very interesting, right? We see that today. Like in this election, I have family members who are on disability and yet support Trump because they're afraid of and don't want a socialist state. And that is the importance of narrative we talked about. Right. And we talk about that in Framing and Communication in the Institute, the importance of the narrative. They start making the term socialism bad, and then everyone starts looking at it as bad. And it has completely confounded me, but I felt this provided an interesting perspective on understanding it. Thank you, Amy, really thoughtful. Sophia, I found it interesting in John Powell's article about how low-income white folks are willing to oppose taxing the rich in the fear that money would go to the underserved poor, because there is an aspirational aspect of whiteness that identifies with the ruling class, even though the gap between middle class and lower class whites, right, in the ruling class is huge. It made me think about what's happening today, right? It's still so very relevant. And that, although it's really old, I mean, we still use it because it is very relevant. We look at our materials to say, oh, do we need to update them? I'm like, no, if you read it today, it's still very relevant. Thank you, guys. So we're going to have to move on, but I appreciate all of your comments here. So I was just really pleased to know that some of you had looked at the materials, because for a while I thought Valerie was the only one. So, all right, we got a great group. I appreciate that. All right, so I just want to start by setting the context. And I can tell from the comments already that we have some folks in this space who already just really get it. When COVID happened, it was already bad enough. The country's been at a standstill. Everybody's been impacted in tremendous ways that we could never think about, ways that I think others could never understand who won't be a part of the COVID sort of generation. And just think about the stories we'll tell and how historic it is, and how we'll be telling these stories to the younger generation as they grow up in terms of what happened and how it happened. But the interesting thing about COVID is it really started a different conversation. Folks shifted and started talking about how this virus was impacting particular communities, particularly communities of color. And for the first time, you heard people now understanding the importance and talking about the importance of collecting data, the importance of understanding sort of why this is happening. People were questioning why are communities of color being impacted so differently. And then, of course, when this happens, we get the regular narrative that we hear. People have these ideas and attitudes around, oh, Black people they don't take good care of themselves. They are not very healthy generation of people. All of the various things you hear that sort of perpetuate this idea around why these inequities happen. And so the importance and why, understanding sort of this concept of structural racialization, but also understanding how the narrative is so powerful, just really started resonating. But most importantly, people were starting the conversation around why a certain subset of folks were being impacted completely differently. And then just to compound things and make matters a little worse, George Floyd happens and all hell sort of breaks loose. And folks are taken to the streets. The protests are beginning. And so we see this inequity around COVID, but now we have to face a different inequity, not some neutral appearing virus, right, that has no actual animus or malice against any particular person. But now we have to confront this idea around why Black men are being murdered at such a high rate by law enforcement, which now is making us face an even bigger truth in our nation. And then, sort of as people took to the streets and the protests started, this momentum started building just from nowhere, as far as I'm concerned. And folks started speaking out and speaking up that we've never heard from before, like Starbucks. And how long have the indigenous population been trying to get the Washington football team to change its mascot and name? And they just all of a sudden sort of dropped that. And now Black Lives Matter, who up to this point had been like enemy number one to a lot, now an organization that folks were starting to understand and embrace. And, even Colin Kaepernick, who was like one of the first ones to take the knee, lost his job, his career as a consequence, received some sort of validation. It's like, oh, everybody got it now. Everybody was like, Cullen was onto something. And then in my home state, I'm here in Mississippi, we've been trying to get rid of this flag with the Confederate battle emblem incorporated for years, at least 10 or 15, as long as I can remember, so many votes on our ballot each year, trying to see what the majority of the state wants. And finally, from pressure from outside groups and the threat of losing money economically, forced our legislature to finally make a change to the flag. In fact, I voted on our new flag yesterday. So just all of these changes were happening across the nation, both locally. And I think we all would have sort of stories in terms of what's happening in our state and our local community as a result of that. Anytime you have a shift so powerful that it begins, you have to be prepared for the resistance, the pushback. When this first started and Trump was issuing his orders, executive orders, and sort of this attack against critical race theory and discussion around diversity and white privilege became like enemy number one, folks in the network, the Racial Justice Network, were sort of despondent by it. They didn't know what to do with that. And my response to them was, anytime a shift is afoot, anytime any real movement or transformative change happens, you have to be prepared for the resistance. So the resistance means you're making progress. If they're pushing back, then they feel you, they hear you. So although it seems sort of bad, it's also the trigger of something really great. So as we talk about this idea of this disproportionality that we see, lots of people were really, for the first time, becoming aware and acknowledged that race plays a role, and COVID was a great way of sort of exposing that. But the truth is, what happened with COVID was not new. It had always been happening, right? We knew that there was this wealth gap. Someone just talked about a few minutes ago that had always existed. And now the wealth gap is showing itself through the exposure of this COVID virus. We knew there was always a gap in unemployment, but COVID just really, expounded that even more in terms of who is being mostly impacted by both the wealth gap, but also the lack of opportunity to jobs and the livable wage. We just talked about residential segregation and how the role that played and what we sort of saw around COVID, but has always been there even from the time of redlining, and how redlining even plays a role in the way we buy and value property today. And then of course, the health impact of both residential segregation, but also the health impact of what happened when something like COVID hits. It really exposes what's happening. It really brings home the importance of expanding stuff like Medicaid, or the importance of this idea around the Obamacare. I saw something the other day, or the Affordable Care Act, where someone was saying now with people who have gotten COVID moving forward, you don't have that pre-existing condition clause. Depending on the kind of treatment you get moving forward, you could in fact be denied. The insurance company can deny payment without that clause, which is really critical. And then of course, the longstanding history around sort of this disparity in education, that even with something like Brown v. Board of Education, it still exists. You know, great concept, great ruling, and it moved a lot. It definitely moved our country as a consequence. It took years to get there depending on where you live. But the reality is we still have a huge disparity as it relates. So disparities in all sort of groups that we see. And so now I want to turn to you again, and I want to hear, you know, in the work that you do, which I'm sure is very diverse. You guys are probably working on different subject matters and areas. What sort of racial disparities have you seen, or even disparities around the intersection of race and poverty? You could share with me in the chat pod. Greatly appreciate it. Just want to hear about the work you're doing. Yeah, Karen brought up the recent murder of Walter Wallace. Yes, Karen, we all feel that as well. And want to lift him up and say his name. Yes.
It's just faster for me. Can we
yeah,
still
unmuting is fine.
Okay. Hi, how are you? Jeannie Dunlop-Kai. I'm a project director at the Senior Law Center here in Philadelphia. And I was going to say, with COVID and all of the, of course, the quarantine practices, the technology divide is just really a killer for us. We are the largest and only independent nonprofit law firm that only services Pennsylvanians ages 60 and older. So we provide free legal services to older adults. And with everything going on, I practice family law. But that being said, you have to have access to a smartphone, best, because now all of our hearings are virtual. Of course, anything you're doing with us has to be on the phone. But even if it's not a smartphone, you still have to have access to a phone. And even just having a phone is a barrier for many. Not being able to walk into the courthouse because you're used to going to get things in person, and everything having to be emails and virtual. It's just really been a barrier. Even communicating with our clients, communicating with the community. These are not the demographic of people who are on LinkedIn looking at posts. So trying to do our outreach and keeping that line going so that the least of these are still being heard has been difficult. Thank you so much for the time.
Yes, thank you. Really appreciate it. And so technology, we're going to talk about that in a minute, has become like a huge component of a new sort of disparity that is reared its ugly head as a consequence of COVID and everything else that's happened. A few others that have come here in the chat pod. Elizabeth says higher energy burden, percentage of income for energy costs for Black and Brown families. Robert said, we do community development work. Everything we do is against the backdrop of racial disparities in housing conditions, rent burden, displacement risk. Thank you, Robert. Amy, benefits programs that have greater proportion of white people get increases and expansions. TANF, which because of the deep poverty and disproportionately includes Black families, hasn't had a great increase since, 1990 in Pennsylvania. That is huge. Jessa says disproportionate involvement in the criminal justice system, right? SSI, I see. So just nursing homes, which have predominantly residents who are people of color, have suffered more COVID cases and deaths, right? And that's really been lifted up than those with primarily white residents. And then Matthew, we sometimes see these disparities exacerbated by or expressed through language barriers, which makes it even worse, right? To compound on top of making it more and more on top of that. One of the things I forgot to do in the beginning, I'm just going to pause real quick for that, is Jay, can you make sure you put the materials in the chat pod? Jay's going to put the materials in the chat pod for those of you who don't have them for today's session. It's not critical to participating, but if you want them, he's going to put them there, which includes the sort of the materials that goes along with this in a worksheet that we'll be using in just a minute. All right, thank you. So lots of examples of racial disparity. It just crosses the gambit, right? Education, I hear, wealth, police violence, and even life expectancy, health outcomes, income disparities that we see. And so what it all means and what it really means for the work that we do is, at the end of the day, it's about access to opportunity. It's about our clients having access to opportunities so that they have a fair chance of living a life, you know, and increasing their level of well-being. Someone mentioned communications, right? So now it's really critical with our children learning from home. Who has a laptop? Who doesn't? Who has internet? Who has high-speed internet versus the children who may, you know, have low-speed internet? And then where I live, there are places where you can't even get the internet. So those children are having to be moved to a space in the community where they can. That's a library or share with another family. Or even sometimes those kids are being forced to now come to the school setting to do their work because they don't have access at home. So talk about having to transition really quickly as communities as a consequence of COVID sort of exposing these varying disparities. Food access is another, which of course correlates directly with healthcare. And all these sort of correlate with each other. You can't talk about jobs or economics without talking about transportation. You can't talk about education without talking about housing. So all of these really sort of are interconnected in one with the other. All right, so now I want to just go back and on a really foundational level say that, you know, race as we know it is a social construct. It really does not exist outside of what we say it is as a nation. And as such, it evolves. It's very complex. It can be very complicated. And some, for instance, were able to come to a space like America and maybe initially had hardships, but were able at some point to assimilate. Whereas others have come to this space that we call America and have never been able and will never be able to assimilate in that way. And given the fact that we understand that race is a social construct, it is very powerful though. And we have to be aware, acknowledge that it has life or death consequences. Something that is a social construct that doesn't even exist just has severe life or death consequences in a space that we live in. And so we have to sort of think about this idea of color blindness versus color consciousness. It comes up quite a bit, so I always try to talk about it. You know, you hear folks say, and even today, people who may not be completely aware will say, you know, I grew up, I don't see race. I'm colorblind. I was taught to be colorblind. I don't see race. But now we understand the problem with that, because if you are a person of color living in a space like America and experiencing it every day, folks who say that they are colorblind are not being aware, nor are they acknowledging the fact that we have different experiences. So we have to get away from this discussion around color blindness and become color conscious. First of all, you can't be colorblind. I mean, we see hues unless you are in fact colorblind. And even in that case, you can tell that there's a different hue. So there's no such thing as colorblindness when it comes to race per se, but also to say that you are colorblind is to deny, to some extent, people of color, such as myself, very existence, to deny our experience. And so if you want to respect and be aware and acknowledge that people have different experiences based on race, you have to be color conscious and get away from saying, I don't see color or that I am colorblind. And then that then builds on the new, you know, what was really refreshing for me this year was that the conversation even shifted. Like we talk about race in the Institute all the time, but now folks are using terms like anti-racism, you know, and we never sort of had used that term up to this point or heard it a lot. Dr. Kendi has this book that a lot of people have read, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. And he really does a great job of talking about this idea of anti-racism. And you see a lot of organizations have come out with their press releases and their statements saying we are anti-racist. And one of my questions generally is, what does that mean to you? What is your understanding of what that means? But what Dr. Kendi is trying to express in his book is that, there's no middle ground anymore. If you say that you are anti-racist, you're saying that you do not exist in the middle ground. So there's one thing to say, I'm not racist. And there's another thing to say that you're anti-racist. But you can't say that you're not racist without acknowledging the fact that silence is complicity, and complicity perpetuates racism. Anti-racism means that you are actively eradicating racism. You are actively confronting it. You are ongoing journey of understanding race and its complexities and how it works in this country, and wanting to both improve in terms of how you respond and understand race, but also improve in terms of what that means for the work that you do in the communities that you serve. And so I want to really briefly sort of talk about right now, my question to you, for those who have, sort of understand this and talked about it, or those who haven't, what's different about this time? We talked about COVID, we talked about George Floyd, and even all of the deaths that have happened there and after, which shows that George Floyd definitely is not the end. So just because people went to the streets and aware and acknowledge what's happened to George Floyd, we have to continue to acknowledge it's still going on, even with all the work that's being done, which shows you that it's going to take a long time to get to where we need to be. But my question to you is, what's different about this time? Or is it different? Do people believe that this time it's different? Do you feel a difference? And if so, what's different about what's happening now versus what happened with Trayvon Martin, or what happened with Michael Brown, or what happened with Eric Gray, So I just want to hear people's thoughts about that. Looking in the chat, Power, anyone who wants to unmute and share, I'm okay with that too.
Hi, this is Dejana Bates from CJP. I just wanted to say, I think that COVID, being in self-isolation, has really slowed people down and required them to see what's going on. Whereas before COVID, when people were out and about and living their lives, they were able to use their lives as a distraction. So now some of these distractions have been peeled back. So I think it is a little bit different this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dejana was saying how, COVID has made people stop and giving folks space to sort of really think about what's happening. So you don't just look at the news, oh, that's horrible, and keep it moving. You almost have to sit in it. Thank you so much. I have a couple of comments in the chat pod. I feel like we're getting closer to a breaking point in this nation. George Floyd was definitely a breaking point. I so agree. In Philadelphia this week, sorry, let me go up. It's really hard to feel that it's different now, as much as I want to hope and believe that I can be right. Is it really different? I mean, Maria, we have to sort of question that at times. What's different now is the blatant display of Trump being the poster face of white supremacy and racism. And from my observation, George Floyd was the first time that, white people saw it as police brutality. I heard conversation amongst people and in forms I never thought I would hear, right? The conversation has shifted and changed. And so I'm going to stop sharing generic. I just want to share this brief video around a conversation that the reporter at MSNBC was having with Dr. Kendi, where he just really very quickly and succinctly talked about what's different now. And so Jay, if you could just share your screen and play that video for us, I'd appreciate it.
Do you believe, though, Mr. President, that many police treat black people differently from white people?
Well, I hope not. I hope not. Certainly
You've seen the statistics.
The knee on the neck was a disgrace, okay?
Yeah.
That was a disgrace.
I'm talking about, what does systemic racism mean to you?
I hope the answer to that question is no. Does anybody really answer that question accurately?
But what
Does
about not
anybody really
hope?
know?
What about analysis? What's your cold-hearted
I have
view of
seen where there is a difference, and I don't want there to be a difference. I don't like that there would be a difference. But with that being said,
Why do you think black men are
police have
2.5
killed
times?
white people.
I know, but why do you think black
In a
men
larger number,
in quantity?
police have killed white
But
people.
why do you think black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white?
That I don't know, but
Why? Why do you
I
think
don't
that?
like it.
But you must have thought
Why?
about it.
I
do you
don't
think?
know why, but I don't like it. I do know this.
Does it speak to
that
something
police
systemic?
have killed many white people also.
But proportionally, what does it speak to?
It speaks to something, if that's the number, you're telling
is the
me a
number.
number. Okay, if that's the number, it speaks to something that to me is unacceptable.
President Trump attempting to discuss systemic racism with Jonathan Swan of Axios a couple of days ago. I believe, thanks to a pair of soup cans and some string, we have Ibram Kendi back with us. Ibram, I feel you. My power's out too. I'm running on a generator right now with 3 trees down in the yard. So I understand you took a power hit, but we're glad you're back. Eddie Glott and I did our very best to convey your piece, but better to hear it from you. So I'll let you lay it out exactly why you see this as an opportunity right now to defeat racism.
Well, really, the heartbeat of racism itself is denial. And I think President Trump, more than any other American figure in recent history, has allowed Americans to see that heartbeat in all of its ugliness. You know, I think when you look at the Trump political career, you see a person who was classifying the president of the United States before him as not American, who called for congresswomen of color, who said that they needed to go back to their homes, who classified nations in Africa and even Latin America in ways we should want to say on national TV. But then when he was challenged for saying those racist ideas, his typical response was, "I'm not racist." And indeed, he said, "I'm the least racist person anywhere in the world." He says, "I'm the least racist person you've ever interviewed, the least racist person you've ever encountered." So the relationship between practicing racism, between expressing racist ideas and denying that racism has really, Trump has put a mirror for all Americans to see, and they don't like it. And they recognize that when they express a racist idea and then say, "I'm not racist," they're acting like Trump. And I think many Americans have decided to stop denying racism because they see that the president consistently denies his own racism. And obviously, once we stop denying a problem exists, then we can start the hard work of fixing it.
All right, Jay, right there. Thank you. All right, so the point that, as I try to share my screen again, Dr. Kendi is making is, at the point we stop denying it, is the point we can start fixing it. And so what's different about today, sorry, do you guys see my screen? You do? Okay. What's different about this time is it's the end of denial for most. Clearly there's some who still denying it, right? But for the most part, folks who before did not see or acknowledge that this was happening have now stopped denying, and they're now having to confront that it exists. All right. So I want to talk about a few other terms that get thrown around quite a bit. This idea, first of all, of diversity and inclusion. It's become really popular and kind of overused, to be honest. But folks use it quite a bit, and they use them together, like diversity and inclusion, like they've really been coupled, but they actually mean two very different things. So I just want to ask again in the chat bar for those who are willing to share, what do you think is the difference between this idea of diversity and then the idea of inclusion? What is the difference between them both? And I am waiting. And then also, so while we're waiting for those responses, I also want for those who feel better with the other one, you know, the difference between this idea of equality and the idea of equity. Okay, Robert says it's a qualitative difference. And what do you mean, Robert, if you can expound a little bit? Sheila says diversity is all the ways that we are different. And then what is inclusion, Sheila? Anne says if we hire people of color and then ignore or mistreat them, then you have diversity, but you don't have inclusion. All right, now we get into it. Diversity is more about optics and inclusion is about giving a voice to unrepresented people. I love it. Okay. There's a difference between diversity and inclusion and whether it's performative or whether it's talking the talk and walking the walk. Yes. All right. Diversity is being invited. Inclusion is being given a seat at the table. I love the analogy. All right. Inclusion is acting of welcoming and treating people fairly. Thank you, Sheila. Equality is giving everyone the same thing. Equity is putting everyone on the same level, no matter how much or little that requires. I love that definition. Thank you. All right, let's talk about equality and equity. Just want to hear, Dejana really sort of summed it up, but other people's thoughts around those terms, because they also get sort of conflated one with the other quite a bit. All right, equality is about everyone being given the same opportunities and rights. Equity is about leveling the playing field. Some may get more than others, right? And it's interesting because we live in a space where some folks just in essence don't even think that's fair. That's the whole crux of the conversation that we're seeing right now, is around this idea of equity and how we get there. And those who feel comfortable in a space where we are trying to level the playing field and give everyone sort of what they need, and those who have this whole sort of capitalistic pull yourself up from your bootstraps mentality, like if you don't have it, then why do we have to give it to you? So it really is a complete two sort of polar opposite ideas around how to approach it or think about it. And as someone said, you know, diversity is about variety. It's quantitative, and equity is about fairness. And inclusion is qualitative, but inclusion is also not just about fairness, but someone said it's welcoming someone. It's feeling that you belong. It's having an environment or culture where you belong. And so, you know, we think about this idea of structural racism, which we're going to get to in just a moment. We're going to dive a little deeper into structural racialization. I just want to remember, you know, anti-racism is about the creation and a proactive sort of reinforcement of policies and practices and attitudes and actions, right, from individuals and institutions as well, that produce equitable power, access to opportunity, treatment, and hopefully the ideas that at the end we have outcomes that are different for everyone. And we want to get to this space of racial equity where we talk about the state where, you know, your race or ethnicity really doesn't predict or play any role and whether you gain some sort of advantage or disadvantage. So that's sort of the pie in the sky idea behind it all. But before we get there, Jay, let's stop. And we're going to take our first attendance poll. All right, attendance poll time. I'm going to give everyone an opportunity. So Jay, if you could put the poll up. All right, Jay said give them a minute. That gives everybody a minute to get ready. There it is. All right. Please respond. And I didn't think I had to say this, but your response probably needs to be yes. Yes would be helpful. Chris says he's not seeing it. And then Kelly says, just a reminder that this poll must be completed by all attorneys participating in this session that are requesting CLE credits. This is the first of two polls. Thank you. Jay, is there something Chris can do to see the poll if he's not seeing? I'm not sure why Chris is not seeing the poll.
Let me just private message with you, Chris, and maybe we can figure it out. But I mean, we can put you on the list as attending for this first one.
All right. And so guys have about 45 more seconds. Most people have answered, but I'm going to move forward. The Jay's going to leave the poll up sort of as we move forward. So, you know, what does this mean for our work? as legal advocates. And that's where we want, you know, everything I just sort of shared before is more foundational, just things, you know, the things I think as race equity advocates that you just need to know, concepts and ideas that people need to understand. And then there are things that sort of, as we think about our work, really integrate into that as we move forward as legal aid and also legal aid advocates who want to be thinking about what that looks like with a race equity lens. So we talk about structural racialization in these 4 levels, both the individual level, which includes internalized, the interpersonal, and the systemic level, which includes the institutional and the structural. So on the first level, which is the individual, I want to start with the internalized, and we'll build from there. So the internalized is about what do we think about ourselves as individuals? What are our individual experiences? As an individual, again, you know, we were sort of talking about what it means to live in America and how that's different as a person of color versus our white counterparts. And as such, it exists basically because we have different experiences. And depending on, but also, you know, we have to, I just need to say this and acknowledge that even people of color, all of our experiences are different. Yes, we're all people of color and some of our experiences will be similar, but we're also very much different individuals. Every person has a different experience. No experience is the same. It's almost like thumbprints, you know, none of them will ever be exactly the same. And so how I feel about myself, my internalized ideas come from how my mama raised me, my experience with my father, my siblings, what I learned and heard from my classmates when I was matriculating through school. What do I see on the news, or the media, the TV? What have I seen? What is, you know, and my grandmama told me. So those experiences sort of shaped who I am. And it shapes me in a way where, in terms of how I believe I'm either inferior to certain people, and it shapes folks who have a feeling of superiority to some extent, you know, based on their experience and what they were told. It creates feelings of superiority as well as inferiority. So as we think about the internalized, each of our own individual experiences, we have to then sort of transition to then what does that mean to the interpersonal? And that is how we interact between two people. So I take my individual experience sort of like a backpack with me as I go out into the world, and then I interact and engage with individuals based on my personal experience. So if I have any experience working with, or when I encounter a white man, you know, am I comfortable? Do I feel inferior? Do I feel superior? Or do I just feel like I measure up? Am I comfortable when I interact with white women? Am I more comfortable when I'm around Black women or Black men or Black people in general? So all that really shapes my interpersonal experience. It's based on what I feel about myself from my own internalized sort of idea. So we go from the internalized to the interpersonal. And then at some point we have to go out into the world, and we then enter in sort of to that systemic level. And we both work within and across institutions. Each of our individual organizations is an institution. The police department is an institution. The schools are institutions. And oftentimes the work that we do as legal aid advocates is really through and challenging institutions. If a client comes in and they have a particular issue, generally we're working, if that's the Department of Human Services or the police department or the housing authority or the school district, there's some institution that has sort of this system of power that we have to sort of go through or challenge or hopefully work with to try and sort of change some of the issues that we see with the clients that we have. And those institutions then create structures. And the structures are really when these institutions then start working together. We were talking about the importance of food and the impact that it has on health, and the importance of health and the impact that it has on education, or the importance of affordable, quality, safe housing and how the impact that has on education. So each of these institutions are working collectively to create structures. So like when you hear something like the school to prison pipeline, and they talk about structural racialization or structural racism, they're really talking about all of these institutions working together to create this whole system of inequity, from the system of inequity that exists at the institution where a child is being disciplined, maybe or maybe not based on their race, how that plays a role when they have to then interact with law enforcement as a consequence of something that happened at school, how that then plays a role as law enforcement interacts with the youth court and they have to go through sort of this criminal legal system. And then the interaction with the youth court and the role that it plays, and then increasing the likelihood that these children would then go to prison. And so you have various institutions working collectively to create this entire system of sort of inequity. So when we talk about structural racialization, we talk about all of these institutions working collectively to do that. All right, the poll has closed. And so this is just another sort of visual around how you build on those 4 levels. We talk about the internalized or the personal, some people call it the personal, the interpersonal, when we're having to then interact with others, the institutional, and then the structural. And then underneath all that, which is what Generic will talk about a little bit more tomorrow, is the unconscious level, this idea of implicit bias. Lots of talk around implicit bias over the last couple of years. And that's really because the idea that there is this unconscious sort of bias that exists really makes it a lot more pernicious. It just perpetuates it in a whole nother level that we didn't, or maybe haven't even thought about in the role that it plays. And so when we talk about structural racialization, we're really talking about sort of this framework or idea, understanding around how institutions, right, have policies and how those institutions have been made to enforce those policies. So like, I mean, a policy on its face can be very neutral, but now we have to depend on individuals who have bias to implement those policies. So a lot of times the inequity does exist at the interpersonal level. It at the internalized level, it exists at the interpersonal level. It exists as an institution because these institutions are built of people, individual people who have their own biased ideas, and it creates and it perpetuates sort of barriers, both economically and socially for people of color, and as a consequence, oftentimes creates advantages for our white counterparts. And so now is your turn to sort of get ready to participate. Generic is going to play a video. You're going to be introduced to this kid called Tony. And we're going to use this sort of animation to demonstrate how these 4 levels work collectively. And then you'll have an opportunity with the worksheet that Generic shared with you in the chat pod to really think through how those 4 levels are playing out in this animation. So as he plays this video, let me go to the next one. You know, you have a sheet that's similar to this, the algebra scenario. I want you to jot down. If you don't have the sheet or you can't print it out, that's okay. Just get a piece of paper and a pen. And as you are listening to this animation and watching, I want you to jot down examples of internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural as they come up. All right, so let me stop sharing. Any questions before Generic launches the video? All right, that means everybody understands instructions. Great. So Generic, whenever you're ready.
Tony is an African-American student about to begin high school. He wants to be the first in his family to attend college and hopes to be a biologist. He did well in middle school and took advanced math, but he didn't score well on the school district's new high school placement exam. Compared to white students, most Black and Latino students don't score as well on this exam. The students of color mostly come from 2 middle schools, known as the worst schools in the district in the poorest part of town. They're overcrowded and have the least qualified teachers. When Tony enrolled at the high school, he was referred to Mrs. Perez, the guidance counselor. He was happy Mrs. Perez was Latina, since most teachers at the high school are white.
Tony, you seem like a good student, but I'd recommend that you enroll in the pre-algebra class instead of the regular algebra class.
Mrs. Perez, for years, has been routinely advising most African American and Latino students to take pre-algebra because a lot of them fail regular algebra.
but I've already taken advanced math class in middle school, and I know that algebra is a requirement before I can take any science classes.
I'd really like to help you, but the school district has new testing policies. If you don't score well on the placement exam, you can't take algebra. Those are the rules.
Mrs. Perez didn't have the heart to tell Tony that his chances of getting into the local college were not good, because you need 3 high school science classes. If you take pre-algebra freshman year and regular algebra sophomore year, you'd have to take all 3 science classes in your last 2 years of high school. That evening, Tony spoke with his parents about the disappointment he felt about the situation at school, and also mentioned how it would hold him back from taking other required classes. His mother told him she would visit the school and speak with his counselor. Tony's mother explained her concerns about him being placed in pre-algebra instead of algebra, including how that would keep him out of mandatory science courses and potentially interfere with college acceptance. But again, Mrs. Perez said her hands were tied, and there was nothing she could do.
Mrs. Perez, I'm very concerned about Tony being placed in pre-algebra instead of algebra. If that happens, it would keep him out of taking mandatory science classes and could interfere with him being accepted to college.
I understand your concerns, but my hands are tied.
I know there are policies, but there has to be something we can do. Tony's a good student, and he's ready to work hard in algebra class.
I'm sorry, but there's really nothing I can do to get around the district's policy on this.
The next day, Tony talked to his friend Jason, one of the few white students who attended the same junior high school as Tony.
Are we going to be in the algebra class together?
I guess not. They're making me take pre-algebra because of my placement test scores. It's the new policy, and I don't have a choice.
Those tests are messed up. Guess you can't do much about it if those are the rules.
Jason didn't tell Tony that he just overheard his white friends in the hall saying, since mostly whites got into algebra class, it proves they must be smarter. Tony then talked to his friend Neri, who is Cambodian, and one of the few Asian Americans at the school.
I have to take pre-algebra too. I don't have the brains to pass the regular algebra class anyway. Who needs advanced math anyway? I can get a better grade in home economics.
As the day went on, Tony realized that most white students had, in fact, gotten into algebra, while most students of color were assigned to pre-algebra. He felt angry, disappointed, and embarrassed about his test scores. He wasn't sure if there was anything he could do. His excitement about beginning high school quickly began to fade.
All right. Thank you, Generic. And so with that, you had your worksheet. That's great. If not, I hope you jotted down some examples. We're going to move you guys into small groups to outline examples of all 4 levels that you've seen. You may want to start with short introductions and then share examples. And then we're going to come back. And I just want to hear from you in terms of both participating in the assignment, but also some of the examples that you guys came up with. Jay, I'm not sure if you or Terrence are going to sort of show how people will know which small group that they're in. First, we're going to share in the chat pod a link to a Google Doc. This Google Doc will take you to a page. Let's see. I can show mine. That looks like this. And this page will, yeah, I see people are getting in. That's great. And when you move into your group, Terrence is going to show you in just a minute how you know which group you're in. You can use this to put your examples in. Don't type yet until it's time. Oh, they're already working. Wait, Anonymous Rabbit. Wait until, because I don't know that that's the group you're in. Don't help them yet. So let me stop sharing. Terrence, Jay, who's going to show them how they'll know which group they're in?
I can help out here, Kim.
All right, thank you. My colleague Terrence is here to help out.
All right, so as Kim said, can you see my slides there?
We can.
Okay, so when you log in, you'll see the worksheets. And then if you don't, on the left, if you don't see an index that says group 1, group 2, group 3, click where you see that red arrow, click on that icon. And when you do, this list will come up, group 1 through group 30, okay? So this is one long document. but each group is going to work in their own, get my microphone down here, in their own part of the document. So you might say, how do I know what group I'm in? Well, let me show you. Right now, you're in the main room. If you look up at the very top of the Zoom room, you'll see a little gray bar and it'll say Zoom meeting. When I start the breakouts in a minute, that's going to change. You see there, it says Zoom meeting. It's going to change and it's going to say breakout room. In this example, it says breakout room 2. You know you're in room 2/group 2. Okay, so once you get into your room, you're going to use that menu on the left side. Let's say you're in group 14, click on 14, and then about 6 people in each group collectively will fill out the table on page 14. Okay, are there any questions? And let me just check. I think most people have logged in. If you haven't logged in, click the link in the chat pod. It's a Google Doc.
What do you do?
Yeah, okay. Laura, what you do, Laura's asking how to make the, let me show you again there, Laura. How to make the, so if the groups are not showing up, you'll see a little icon at the it looks like a little document at the top left. Click that little icon, and when you do, the menu will appear like this.
What do you click?
Say again?
Now, what do you click?
Do you see the Google link in the chat pod?
Yeah, I opened that.
Okay, so then just stand by. Terrence is going to put you into a small group, and at the top of your screen, you'll see which group number you're in. And if you click on the left-hand side of the Google Doc, you see all these lists of group numbers, and you go into your group, and that's how you'll know you're in the right group.
Okay.
Okay. Don't worry, once we start moving, if you have any questions, if you just send us a shout out, we'll help you get there. So no worries.
All right, so I'll start the groups now. And Kim, we're giving them, what's about 10 minutes for this, do we say?
This is 20.
20, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And folks, I will send you little messages to let you know how you're doing on time. You'll see a little message will pop up on your screen. So I will start the groups now. Stop sharing.
Some ideas of some of the things that popped up for you in your small groups. Anybody willing to unmute and share with us an example of the internalized, the first level of racialization? Or you can type it in the chat pod. Just want to hear what your group sort of came up with.
I think I just wanted to start with saying overall, I experienced this last night as I was doing the homework. And then it came out in our group as well that we were struggling with some of the differences between, you know, the internalized and the interpersonal. And I think even more so between the institutional and the structural.
Thank you, Janice. And that's common, especially the institutional and structural. I want to first by saying a lot of times they bleed over, but the internalized is just particular to an individual, just one person. Whereas interpersonal only happens when there's more than one, when one person is interacting with another. So it's sort of how you interact with another person based on your own experiences. Really quickly, but I'm just seeing some examples here of, okay, Arthur said he was in group 6, and internalized was the white classmate saying, Jason, he said white people in algebra class means that they're superior, right? So it's just this idea that when you have a class and it only has white students in it, then that sort of internalizes this idea that they must in some way be superior. And then one student actually saying it, you know, verbalizing it. And so as a consequence, what that means. Guys, I'm sorry. Somebody rang my bell. My dog is barking. Work with me. And then the Cambodian student, Neri, who says that I don't have the brains for algebra. So this experience in some way has created a situation where she feels sort of inferior, feels like she can't do math. And as such, she sort of relegated herself to this idea around home economics, which she thinks for whatever reason is easier. Oh, I love this one. So somebody says Tony feels demoralized and frustrated, right? So at the beginning of this, Tony was just trying to figure it out, right? He went to see his counselor, Ms. Perez. He went home and told his parents. I mean, he's really sort of navigating these barriers and trying to just get into algebra because he understands, you know, what that could mean for his future. By the end of this experience, we have a child who has gone from being excited about taking algebra to you like just being despondent and demoralized, like somebody was saying, frustrated. Tony's mother worrying, right? So she's Tony's mother sort of internalized ideas around even, you know, even think about that, what it means for her to be a parent to a student who is not getting into algebra. What does that mean for her own self-confidence and her belief in terms of what type of parent that she is? The advisor believing that Black and brown kids need to take pre-algebra because she's seen a lot of them fail algebra, right? So Ms. Perez, for whatever reason, and Ms. Perez is a great example. I think there's always this idea that there's this dichotomy between Black and white. It's like you either Black or you white, right? But the truth is, these internalized ideas also create barriers when it comes to people of color for other people of color. We also internalize these ideas, and as such, you'll have people of color who feel not only that they're inferior, but feel that people who are similar to them are inferior, or that a particular person is inferior, and they'll have feelings of exceptionalism. Like, I went through law school, I got my degree, so for some reason I'm better than others, and as such, I see other people of color, I may think that they're inferior, but I have some sort of feeling of exceptionalism because I made it through and I was able to make it through, or even the feeling that because I'm able to make it through, others can. So if you haven't, then for whatever reason, you've done something to prevent yourself. So these feelings cross within the same racial demographics. It crosses across demographics. So it really does play. But Ms. Perez, you know, when Tony first came in, he thought he had a bit of an ally. He saw another person of color, only to learn that for whatever reason, Ms. Perez is taking this position. All right, guys, lots of great examples here. Let's move on to the interpersonal. So interpersonal, sort of when one person interacts with another. And I'm just looking at the Google Doc, but please fill in the chat pod too. Someone says that the Black students must not be smart, right? So one student verbalized that. So you don't know whether the other students are thinking that, but as they're walking together and one says that, then now you putting it in the atmosphere, right? It's like when folks say that socialism is bad, or when they say voting by paper ballot or voting absentee ballot is fraudulent, you know. So you're putting it in the atmosphere, and people take that in and absorb that and internalize it and then repeat it. That's sort of how it happens. That interpersonal communication is very critical, because depending on who that person is, if it's someone that you admire or you respect, someone like a president, then it carries weight. And as such, it's very powerful, that interpersonal idea. The other one says, oh, y'all already started doing the strategies. Underfunded, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to the interpersonal. Other examples, here we go. Advisor says that sending Tony to pre-algebra without fighting for him. Right, and I suspect Ms. Perez has had several sort of interpersonal experiences with other students of color who are trying to get into this class. And at some point, either she just gave up. I mean, we don't know about Ms. Perez. We don't know if she just gave up, or maybe she's been fighting for kids prior to this and hasn't gotten anywhere. And so she knows there's no need for me to go down there to the principal's office and try and have this conversation again. I know what they're going to say. Or maybe even a fear of losing her job if she tries to push back. So oftentimes when we're doing our advocacy and these things come up, you know, you talk about this a little bit in implicit bias for those who sign up tomorrow, we make these assumptions around why people are doing things. And we may not know the whole story. We may not know Mrs. Perez's own internalized ideas and issues that then puts her in a space where when she's interacting with a student like Tony, this is her position. So then you have to question, what is Mrs. Perez's internalized sort of attitudes and ideas around both this pre-algebra, but also students of color who are getting in there. All right. So Janice brought up earlier just the sort of difficulty in the deciphering between institutional and structural, and they also bleed into each other. I want to say this, and some examples can be the same. So like when you talk about the interpersonal, you can't really talk about the interpersonal without understanding each of the individuals. So you have to understand the internalized of each of the individuals involved, but also the communication between the two interpersonal. And institutional structural like that. Institutional is generally one institution. That's the school district, that's colleges, that's a police department. Structural is when these institutions start to work conjunctively one with the other. So I just want to get some examples of institutional real quick. And I'm looking at your Google Doc. Let's see. The placement exam, right? The policy at the high school and the way the exam is written. So the exam is a part of the school district's institution. That's a policy and even a tool that they use to, I guess, determine a child's aptitude. That's part of the institution of the school district. Okay. And then someone put that the fact that the bad schools exist in the poorest part of town with the worst teachers and the least qualified teachers, that is an example of institutional to some extent, but it's really an example of structural, because it really shows how, again, housing, something like property taxes, funding, school funding, all of these components play a role in creating a structure where you have a school that is that has the worst teachers, the least qualified teachers, and the least funded school district. It takes a lot of institutions and policies to create a space where a school has been defunded, and then that then plays a role in the quality of teachers that you get, which then trickles down to the education the student gets, right? That then trickles down to a student like Tony who now cannot get into pre-algebra, but then trickles down to a student like Tony who now has to take all these additional courses to try to catch up, and then trickles down to creating a barrier for him to get to college. So all of these structures are playing a role in systemically keeping him out from getting a quality education, first of all, but even getting to a space where he can get to college, right? And then college plays a role into his ability to get a great job, which plays a role in his ability to get a great home, that then perpetuates a system where now he's in a place where, depending on where he's living, the next generation of children that he's producing now is in that sort of cycle. And that's how we create sort of these cycles and these, what you say, structure of inequity that continues to replicate itself over and over again. So, all right, this is great. I see that some of you guys have started, but for those who haven't, I want us to, we're gonna go back into small groups really quickly, but before we do that, it's attendance poll time. So second attendance poll, giving you guys a chance to get ready. I'm not sure if Terrence or Generic, whoever is gonna pull the poll up for us. Let's get our second attendance poll so we can get that out of the way. All right, are you currently actively participating in this session? Let's go. There we go, very good. I'm just gonna pause for the cause, give you guys a moment to take the poll. Kelly has iterated earlier that in order to get your CLE, you need to vote yes on both of these polls. All right. And so I was just giving people a minute to sort of do that before we roll into our other small. So we got a few seconds. We're gonna give you guys a few minutes to do that. While we are waiting on everyone to take the poll, does anyone feel comfortable just talking about what does this mean for our advocacy? What does this mean for the work that we do with the clients that we interact with each day, as well as ultimately with the advocacy that we do, even if that's representing one client or if that is as an organization trying to challenge something more systemic that we see across clients. Anyone see a relevancy to sort of this idea of these 4 levels in the work that they do? Because there is a connection.
Hi, Kimberly, this is Rebecca. I'll go ahead and speak.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I can say that in my work that I do with legal services, I definitely see how this impacts us dramatically. I'm a rare bird here in that I'm not an attorney. I'm a social worker who works in family law, specifically in Pittsburgh. And I really think that if we do not recognize this and we do not see this and how it impacts our clients' lives dramatically, that we can't serve them the way that we want to, because we have to understand how this works for them and each different experience, you know, and for each different person, because it's not going to be the same from person to person to person. But we have to truly work on rooting it out and examining it and, you know, making sure that we do not fall into the category of the counselor, right, that everybody was just describing, because we are making these generalizations and we're saying that our clients can't just because of whatever's in their past or whatever the color of their skin is or their sex or orientation. And I think that we need to do a better job in recognizing that.
Yeah, and Sierra sort of piggybacks on that in the chat pod. She says we need to work to self-evaluate and learn what things we have internalized so that we can be aware of how to interact with our clients to do the work. That's great. And that's the beauty of tomorrow's session. It really sort of builds on what we're talking about today, because then you really are going to sort of examine some of your own internalized and how that plays a role in how we interact with our clients. But also, I think you're going to do it in the context of a hiring context. Like, what does that mean for how we hire people into our organizations? What structures do we have in place as an organization? And what biases do we have individually that may impact sort of the outcomes we see and the diversity that we have in our organization? So thank you. That's very insightful. I really appreciate that. All right, so the poll is closed. And so with that, Terrence is going to quickly put you back in the small groups. Now I want you to work on strategies. What are some of the strategies that we see around each of these 4 levels? What are some of the strategies for the internalized, for the interpersonal, for the institutional, and for the structure? I just want to talk about strategies a little bit when we come back, because we have about 30 minutes left, so not a lot of time. But Terrence is going to put you in the small groups, and then we'll come back and talk about that and wrap up today's session. All right, Terrence, whenever you're ready. And we go back to the same Google Doc. I don't know if we need to drop the link back into the chat pod, Jay, just in case someone got out of the document. Now they need to get back into it. And hopefully the traffic won't be as bad now that most people are already in there. I know at some point, some folks were having a problem getting in because there was so many people getting in at the same time. All right. So Terrence, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, and Generic has just put the link in the chat pod if you want to click on it before I start. If you weren't in a small group the first time around, give me a few seconds and I'll, once the small groups start, I'll pop you into one. Okay, here we go.
Enjoyed small groups. So we were talking about strategies at the different levels. I'm letting folks continue to pop in before I start. Okay. Talking about strategies at the different levels, strategies that we see or ideas that we had in terms of strategies in this particular scenario. So I want to just start with the internalized and the interpersonal. What are some of the strategies that you guys came up with? You can either share in a chat pod or if someone wants to unmute, that'd be great too. I'm gonna find the chat pod. Yeah.
This is Sheila. We didn't talk about it so much directly in our room 30, but clearly about educating yourself, the interpersonal as well as the individual. The clip that you showed at the beginning about the end of denial, there are so many levels of denial that we are all in. I say to my clients all the time, there are a lot of Black people who are the gatekeepers of the systems that exist. We're going to talk about hiring tomorrow. You know, they put people in these HR positions to kind of keep people calm and, you know, we don't want an uprising here. We don't want to talk about why the top of the house is all white and all male and the bottom of the house is the complete opposite of that. So I think the ongoing struggle to self-educate and to educate the people that you interact with. In my group, we recommended the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. If you haven't read it, Google an interview with her. It will change your worldview.
Yeah, so what I hear Sheila saying is, you know, continuing to educate ourselves and to learn both around sort of how this idea of race plays out in the world, but also our contribution. And she talks about these gatekeepers, folks who sort of, and the thing about gatekeepers is they generally feel like they're doing good work and that they are sort of protecting, but in some ways they can at times perpetuate sort of what we're seeing. So, you know, a lot of organizations are really trying to tackle this internalized, well, more so the interpersonal. You know, you hear organizations talking about the relationships amongst colleagues, how we talk to each other, respect, and they're bringing in trainers around the idea of diversity. There's anti-racism training going on. This and other things. And Generic is going to talk a little bit tomorrow around some of the strategies that you use to sort of de-bias ourselves. Once we acknowledge and we're aware that implicit bias exists, how do we change that? And the importance of cross-cultural dialogue, like giving yourself these different experiences, really taking the time to get to know folks who are not like you, and broadening, sort of expanding your horizon and ideas. The more information, actual factual information you give yourself, the less you will assume, the less your brain will sort of fill in gaps. But again, you'll talk about that a lot more tomorrow. All right, thank you, Sheila. And then let's move to sort of the institutional and the structural. These are the levels that as advocates we work at the most, because we're normally challenging or trying to fix something institutional. And within an institution, if that's a policy, sometimes it's a person. And then for those of us who do systemic work, we're really trying to tackle the structural level, that level where they all sort of come together to make it even worse. So any ideas or strategies that people talked about? Somebody also talked about The Warmth of Other Suns is also great, which is also a book by Isabella Wilkerson. So just look her up. She's got some great stuff out there. But any ideas around the institutional and structural? So we talk about, I just want to go back to the internalized, some of the strategies that we often see when we want to tackle the internalized, like how people feel about themselves, is like mentorship programs. You know, we get kids mentors, folks to help boost their confidence and their ideas around themselves, gives them different experiences, broaden their horizon. And then sometimes, depending on what the issue is, you know, another sort of internalized strategy is tutorial services. We'll give a child tutoring if they're struggling in math or something. Let's get someone to help build their capacity around that area. Like we talked about in the interpersonal, we talked about this idea of diversity training or race training, anti-racism training, and then the idea of cross-cultural dialogues. And when we talk about cross-cultural dialogue, sometimes that's when organizations create affinity spaces, and then those affinity spaces come together, or our colleagues in different races come together to have these discussions. They read books, they'll, you know, watch films, and then it creates a space where we can sort of open the dialogue around these areas in a safe space where we can sort of talk about what we see and how that feels and lands on us. The institutional and structural as a number, but I want to hear some people's ideas around the institutional, because that's sort of the crux of what's happening with Tony. All right, somebody's got here. More flexibility. Strict rules are not good. Reevaluating and changing the rules that set up barriers to opportunities. Having a culture in school where guidance counselors or parents can challenge the unfair rules, right? Creating a safe space, providing outlets for feedback to the school and school district. Abolishing the entrance exam, right? Using other determining factors to see if the students will be able to do the coursework, right? Why does this one test have to be the be all and end all? We've all been the victim of that one test, right? Anyone who's had to take a licensure exam or went through graduate school, it's generally that little one test. I mean, can you imagine being graduating law school and not being able to pass the bar exam? You know, how that could impact your ability to get a decent job and move forward in a career that you put a lot of years of education. There's some people who are in that space. And I live in a space where they're creating more barriers. They just instituted a rule from our Supreme Court in Mississippi, where if you don't pass the bar in 3 years, you got to go back to law school and get 12 credit hours. Right. Is that not the craziest thing you ever heard? Talk about a barrier. I mean, there's another Tony situation. And then what I was wondering is, what are those 12 hours going to exist of that's going to prepare them to pass the exam that they didn't have before? Anyway, so things like that. Those are great examples that you guys talked about. I'm just going to look at a few more. Getting rid of the standardized tests. So many people are held back by them, right? And if you really listen closer to the scenario, Tony said that he had taken advanced math and had done well before. So he's shown an acumen to do the work. Why is this exam now the one thing that says that now he can no longer do advanced math? Or in an ideal world, how about any child who wants to get into algebra, let them in and give them the necessary support they need to succeed? How about that? How about we teach them and not put them in a situation where they have this larger caseload in the back end? And then the structural, some examples of structural that you guys had. I saw someone said in the Google Doc, just the inequitable funding scheme is one, right? So that's a structural issue, because that funding scheme, of course, like we said before, ties into housing, which then ties into the tax base, which then ties into how much money each school gets. And then even like the institution of the school board, the role that they play. If you live in a district that has multiple schools, if you ever been in a space where one school seems to be thriving and having all sorts of resources and the other school don't even look like it's in the same district, you know, how do you justify that as a school district? Somebody said adjusting the tax base and contributions. We just talked about flexible college requirements. I wonder how much the colleges know how the way the scheme is set up in the school impacts the kids' ability to even get to them. Are the colleges, how much are the colleges and the schools like communicating, and how the schools are creating barriers for kids to even get to them? So that is another great example of structural. All right, we've come close to the end of our time, and I just want to leave a little space for questions. If anybody had any questions or, you know, closing comments before we wrap up. We've got 4 more minutes.
I have a quick question. Was there going to be another check-in?
George, we had 2 check-ins. Did you?
I didn't get the second one. What should I do? I did the first one.
Richard wagging his finger. Can you email Kelly? Do you have Kelly's? Can you put Kelly's email address in there, generic? Just email Kelly and let her know. Okay. And she'll tell you what you need to do. Sorry about that, George.
Okay.
Any other questions, guys, before we wrap up? Wanted space for questions. All right. Well, that must mean everybody has it, right? Everybody knows. So if nothing else, I just want you to leave. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I want to leave you with understanding how these 4 levels play in the work that you do, both in how we as individuals think, and then how that plays in our interactions with our clients as they come through the door, how we're analyzing the institutions that we're challenging, and then how hopefully the work that we're doing is also touching on the broader structural issues. It can be overwhelming when you sort of outline it all, because structural issues are huge. But as advocates, we have to think about where can we plug in? Where do we have the leverage to maybe change? Is that changing the test? You know, you can challenge the test. You can challenge the college's requirements. There's so many different levels and places where you can plug. So if you use this strategy, these 4 levels, and map out sort of the issue that you're doing, then you can say to yourself, like, where should we start? And there are multiple levels you can start at. no way you can tackle the entire structure, but you can think about where can I plug in to make the greatest impact. So I want to leave you with this poem that I've been sharing with people that was written about, what if 2020 isn't canceled? What if 2020 isn't canceled? What if 2020 is the year we've been waiting for? A year so uncomfortable, so painful, so scary, so raw that it finally forces us to grow. A year that screams so loud, finally awakening us from our ignorant slumber. A year we finally accept the need for change, declare change, work for change, become the change. A year we finally band together instead of pushing each other further apart. 2020 isn't canceled, but rather the most important year of them all. All right, have a great day. I hope you guys come back tomorrow to see Generic and talk a little bit more about implicit bias. If you need some additional resources or information, I'm going to put my email address here. Please reach out. That's what we're here for. It's Kimberly Merchant at Parvati. I can't spell. ParvatiLaw.org. Shoot me an email and I'd be glad to hear from you. All right, guys. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.